Hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to start this first webinar. This is really the beginning of this project we have with the Inspire Consortium and the support with the support of the DG ECHO. I'm just going to introduce a bit about the team and how we are going to manage this first webinar. And after that, Josh will take the floor. We have the floor for the presentation, and after that for the debate with you all. I'm Camille Nussbaum. I'm here. I'm working at IECA in Madrid, in Spain. IECA is part of the Inspire Consortium with Group URD in France, GPPI in Germany, and ODI in the UK. And these four organizations are supporting DG ECHO for the development of new policies, new trainings for their staff and partners in Brussels and also at field level. And as part of this 4-year framework contract we have, we are starting now this new project about best practice and universal standards for logistics in humanitarian action. And we are a small core team for this project. I'm the coordinator, and I'm working with George Fenton. He'll introduce itself in 1 minute. And we have also our colleague Daniel Garcia Ibanez. He's not here today, but he's going to participate to the next webinars in Spanish and in French next week. Just a few more comments. This is a webinar. This is the opportunity to discuss with all you guys from many countries and locations. And we really want this to be something interactive, useful for this project, to have debates, to have the opportunity to introduce the project, to have also many insights from you. And we are going to use this platform, the Zoom platform. Please, if you have any problem with the IT issues or things like that, please use the chat so we can provide some advices to try to solve these problems. If you have some comments or questions regarding the things we are discussing about logistics, about the presentation, please use the Q&A sections so we can manage and organize the questions and the comments and discuss every topics you'll identify. Just the last comments. At the end of this webinar, we are recording currently the webinar, and we'll publish the video next week. I think we have all your emails, and we'll share with you these recordings and also information about the next step of the project. I think this is it for the beginning. George.
Thank you very much, Camille. So I'm George Fenton, and I am speaking to you today from the UK. My role is, I have a dual function really in this case, partly with the Humanitarian Logistics Association, which is working with IECA on communicating what we're doing with the project. So using various channels to share information, publish things like webinars such as this one today on our YouTube channel. And I'm also working part-time as a technical advisor to the project. So I would like to run through a series of slides and a couple of points. Then within that, we'll have a chance to answer some questions. Thanks, Camille. So the objective of the webinar today really is to introduce the standards project, which Camille mentioned is now being managed by the Inspire Consortium, and particularly Camille is acting as a project coordinator on behalf of IICA. We want to be able to share the initial findings from a pre-project survey that we launched a few months ago, and some of you, I think, have provided some useful feedback. And we want then to discuss next steps for a global consultation process with the humanitarian logistics community. Next slide. So why are we doing this project? Why is there a need for humanitarian transport and logistics standards? So I think we could agree that by adhering to commonly agreed minimum standards, we could ensure the respect to key principles, both sectoral and organizational. We could avoid reinventing the wheel. We could enable the use of the same terminology, and we could better describe what is expected of each process in terms of output and outcome. And we could harmonize internal processes among different departments and among different branches or missions within large organizations. So in terms of global humanitarian contexts, the transport and logistics function is essential to enabling fast, effective responses to crisis. Yet to be successful, many different organizations must work together, including disaster management authorities, local government staff, defense personnel, UN agencies, NGOs, private companies, individuals, a whole range of different actors. And each of these groups has often different ways of responding, different ways of communicating, and that can create significant challenges. So the hypothesis is that by improving the availability of logistics knowledge and globally endorsed minimum standards, outcomes and logistic performance can better be achieved. Organizational accountability, quality, and donor reporting could also be improved, as common practices can more easily be established. Simpler and often cheaper systems could be developed, and emergency staff would be more able to work effectively between organizations and different groups. So standardized approaches that are commonly understood among key stakeholders could contribute to better coordination and more consistent outcomes. Previous attempts, I mean, we must recognize that previous attempts towards creating common standards for humanitarian logistics have not always been well coordinated. And over the last few years, many organizations have been working on their own standards and guidelines. And this has led sometimes to duplicated effort and in some cases different standards. Hence the need for a more coordinated and inclusive approach to recognizing and endorsing minimum common standards. Next slide. So going back a few years to 2016, when the World Humanitarian Summit launched, or the Grand Bargain, as it was called, was launched through the World Humanitarian Summit. And this being an agreement between some of the largest donors and aid providers that wanted to get more resources to those in need, particularly obviously at the local level. There was a commitment to channel at least 25% of resources to the local level, with the aim that these changes would include greater support for national and local responders, and therefore help to harmonize reporting requirements. They would provide more cost efficiency in the use of common resources, perhaps through working more effectively in partnerships and through consortia. But all these points need coordination and consistent outcomes and accountability. So hence, in this case, for us, the humanitarian logistics community, agreeing on better ways of recognizing or of operating through recognizing common standards is important. Secondly, last year, DG ECHO funded a study on its use of transport and logistics services and its strategy for that. The recommendations from that study included the need to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of DG ECHO's funding on transport and logistics, that it should leverage its influence as a large donor to improve the sector as a whole, and ultimately design a transport and logistics policy document. A key recommendation from that study also supported the introduction of universal standards for transport and logistics, hence where we are now today, launching this project to look at that in more detail. On this key point, there is now a need to launch a global consultation process to map, identify gaps, endorse and compile humanitarian logistics standards into a single document, and ensure that any final product also complies with wider international humanitarian aid standards. So this would be aimed at a broad range of humanitarian actors, including academics, government staff, companies, NGOs, other international aid organizations. And to support this process, we, as I mentioned earlier, conducted a pre-project survey. So I thought it'd be useful now to share a few of the highlights from that survey. We had about 200, almost 230 responses. So yeah, it gives us a good idea of where things stand. So next slide, please. So what you'll see from this slide is that most of the respondents, about 38% of the respondents were from international NGOs. We had a good number from academic institutions and a reasonable response rate from the private sector. About 26% commercial respondents overall. Next slide. Most of the respondents, 71%, came from Africa, and a good mixture of other locations. We would have liked there to be more response from Latin America, Pacific, etc. But hopefully through the consultation process, the engagement there will improve. Next slide. So you'll see what was significant about the responses, and I suppose I'm not hugely surprised, but overall 91% of the respondents felt that the development of commonly recognized standards is either very important or important. So hopefully we're on the right track here. And then this was an interesting one here, and how important do you consider common humanitarian logistics standards to be? And in terms of the different categories that we suggested. So the greatest level of support was in the area of planning and preparedness, medical logistics, procurement, of course. Interestingly, protection has really come up a lot, and in the area of protection in logistics is something that historically hasn't really been adequately addressed, in my view, and so it's good that that's seen as a high priority now. I mean, of course, everything was seen as pretty important. Surprisingly, possibly the issue of the environment and green logistics came lowest on the ranking, but maybe now with the interest in climate change, that will increase further. Next slide. So we also asked about the the sort of the standards that are currently used or most frequently used in people's work. And so it's good to see that Sphere obviously is well recognized. The SIPS procurement standards are very well recognized. The parcel project standards are fairly well recognized. And then other organizational policies and procedures and standards as indicated there. But the top three: Sphere, SIPS and parcel. So yes, so are there any questions, comments at this point? Let me look at the chat.
Please use the Q&A tool if you have any question or comment at this point. Otherwise, we can proceed.
Okay, so no questions at this point. Let's move on. So what we've, I see maybe one question here.
Yeah, Axel.
Plenty of questions coming later. Very good. We'll move on. So what we've started to do, and we need to do a lot more intensively in the design of the next phase of the project, is to review existing standards. And this slide is just trying to recognize that, largely speaking, there are 4 areas where standards are important, or where certainly standards and guidelines are considered, i.e. in terms of policy, the guidelines themselves, procedures and rules and tasks, responsibilities and checklists. And I think what we're trying to say here is that one of the key phases of our project is researching the standards produced by various actors. And we want to be able to consider different aspects, as I've just said, and think about things such as the USA procurement guidelines, or MSF logistics library, or the parcel project standards, or the logistics operations guide from the logistics cluster. And we can sort of map these over the 4 governing documents, or governing categories of policies, guidelines, procedures and tasks. And it's evident that depending on the nature of the agency and its scope of operations, its guidance documents are in some cases either closer to policies or closer to procedures. And so if we check on some of the donor guidance papers on logistics and procurement, we find that often they stand at quite high level. Obviously they're strongly principle guided and not very specific. And while perhaps that gives more flexibility, this is one of the reasons why some NGOs occasionally struggle to find specific instructions on how to apply donor regulations. Because essentially some such specific rules often don't really exist. And interestingly, however, standards adopted by NGOs regularly stand at somewhat of a lower level between perhaps procedures and guidelines. And in some cases, these documents are drafted as technical papers with the aim to guide field teams and on how to ensure accountability and compliance with the donor regulations. So clearly, I think what we're seeing is that there's a need to find more alignment, perhaps simplify some of the language being used, and make a lot of the existing material more accessible, easier to understand and apply. So we're not trying to create new standards and guidelines, we're just trying to look at what's already available and find a a coherent way of bringing that all together in an more easily digestible manner. I mean, I could talk, maybe I can talk a little bit later about some examples of some of the standards that currently exist, but maybe let's go on to the next slide. What are the project objectives? Well, they are to compile standards to assess and verify good humanitarian practices, align with existing initiatives, and to ensure, as I was saying, broad access to a global audience. And it will be here very important to ensure that we get donor endorsement to this process for the promotion of the standards and the recognition of the standards and help. Hence, it's really a great opportunity now that we have that ECHO, in this case, as a key donor, is supporting this project and can help to gain support from other donors, hopefully. So if we, let's see, my notes here. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So what's the project approach? What does it look like? We've got a steering committee now forming through the Inspire Consortium members. And what we want to do is put together a technical advisory group and a smaller writing group. And it's possible that maybe some members of the technical advisory group would also form the writing group. And we've got two thematic experts, myself and Daniel. So together, the idea is that the project team manages the global consultation process. And I should also add at this point that we are collaborating closely with Sphere, who, we want to make sure that we are complying with the Sphere framework for conducting a global consultation process, because the ultimate aim is to ensure that any final product can be endorsed as a Sphere companion guide. And perhaps in the future, some elements of that guide could ultimately be included in the Sphere manual itself. The technical advisory group is obviously going to be the key element of the project team. And they would represent a variety of constituencies and technical expertise in humanitarian action. And they would provide advice on the development of the standards themselves. A lot of the consultation process will be like this, online, through webinars, Skype calls, etc. And we do have some budget to run 2 or 3 face-to-face workshops. And also we want to take advantage of other events and workshops that are happening over the next 10 months or so, up until June next year, where we can take the opportunity to meet with face-to-face with people who are interested in what we are trying to do. There's a workshop, for example, that will be included in the next HLA General Assembly in Nairobi at the beginning of October. There are several events, I think, happening in Europe in November and December. And then the Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week in Geneva in February will be another opportunity, should any one of you be interested in joining those. Next slide. So the project will be in 4 phases, as I said, up to the summer of 2020. Beginning with the desk review, which we're starting now, and then drafting through a period of a couple of months where we'll conduct various interviews and consultations, culminating in the development of a pilot document, a draft document, which won't necessarily include everything that's needed, but will include some critical components and standards and guidelines that can be tested by organizations that are willing to do that. It will be vital to ensure that there's a consistent use of easy to understand terminology, language and content and structure. And that's again where Sphere is being helpful for us. And we want to be able to determine the most beneficial approach and ensure that the project team can consult with various stakeholders so that we can select the right format, categories for the standards. And overall, the project will encourage a broad engagement and hopefully ownership in the humanitarian logistics community. And feedback during the consultation phase will be collected through using various tools, including surveys. So we want to be able to conduct a series of surveys just to solicit the right sort of feedback. And as I mentioned, workshops and webinars. Ultimately, and we also want, by the way, to do this in French and Spanish as well as in English. So we can ensure a wider and an inclusive consultation. So I think I'll stop there and maybe move on to the final slide, which now we would like to answer some of your questions, have a bit of discussion and get your feedback, if we may. So to kick things off, it would be great if you could think about your work and your organization and how useful you think the project could be to supporting your activities. As mentioned earlier, there have been previous attempts towards creating common standards for humanitarian logistics that haven't necessarily been that well coordinated. So do you have any suggestions around how to ensure a more coordinated and inclusive approach? How feasible do you think this project should be, or is rather, based on what we've said so far? Do you know of any other standards that perhaps weren't considered as part of the survey? And yeah, I mean, maybe I'll stop there. We've got a few other questions, but let's have a look at the Q&A function and see whether we've got any questions that we can answer. Okay.
Thanks, George, for this great presentation. And let's start the debate thanks to the Q&A tool. I can see here we have two first questions from Alex and Fanny. Also, we have also received other questions through emails we can also discuss, but maybe you can start with the question about how in line with the Sphere standards we would be with this project. I can maybe just share some quick elements and you can add more, George. When we started this project 1 month ago or more or less, we had some interesting discussions with the Sphere project in Geneva, because the first assumption for this project would be to try to have something in line with the Sphere standards, with the Sphere handbook, and ideally in some years have something like a partner standard of the Sphere standards. So we would try to design. We are very at the beginning of the project, but the first assumption, as I mentioned, would be to design standards with the same format, with links to the charter principles, with the core links to the core humanitarian standard, and work with the Sphere movement in Geneva. George, maybe you want to add more on that?
Yeah, so thanks, Axel, for your comments. As Camille says, we've had some interaction already. We are not necessarily yet part of the Humanitarian Standards Partnership, but we want to make sure that we're very much aligned with the HSP. And yeah, it's great that you think that involving the private sector is a good idea. We've already been talking to members of different big logistics companies like DHL. They're certainly interested. There are others that we're going to involve in our event in Nairobi next month. So I think your suggestion to involve the global sphere focal points is a very good one. We'll certainly try and do that. So the next question I can see here is, what is the expected timeline for consultations and pilot? So the consultations, Camille, just remind me, the consultation is probably going to start soon?
Yeah, we are now in the first phase to have a clear idea about the format of the standards and what we could achieve. The project is a one-year project, so we'll have to have this final pilot version of the standards in next June, July. And in October, we would decide what would be the format of the standards, and we'll start to draft a first version of the standards, and we would have an open consultation next year, at the beginning of next year, with the workshops you mentioned, George.
Great.
In Geneva, tentatively in Geneva in February, in Europe, and maybe in March, April, one workshop in Africa, one workshop in Asia, and also, as you mentioned, George, through webinars and IT tools.
Great. So another question here from Fanny is, does the project also comprise reflection around digitalizing logistics, and what should be the applicable standards? Yeah, I mean, yes, the answer is we will certainly be looking at the use of digitalizing logistics processes, and also there's a strong link I myself am interested to make between cash-based assistance, mobile technology, understanding market-based supply chains to enable the use of digital assistance through cash. So there are various aspects I think that it will be important to look at there.
Yeah, maybe Axel, I can answer maybe one. As you mentioned, you asked how we are going to be in line with FEAR, and you are mentioning the CHS. So as I answered, we'll include the CHS as a key reference, and yeah, maybe not also processes, but also policies linked to the logistics standards. And there is also a question from Theophan. Maybe you can answer, George.
Yes, so the question is, which topics will be covered by this project? Transport, warehouse, procurement, fleet, etc. Yes, so certainly those aspects will be covered, including asset management, distribution, cross-cutting standards, and standards that particularly haven't recently necessarily been considered as important to logistics, such as protection in logistics and yeah, well, what I was just saying earlier, this digital use, digital technologies and linkage with cash transfers. So those would be two other gaps possibly that we have in the current material that is available. Next question from Will Holden. Thanks, Will. Are there plans to reach out to our Arabic-speaking supply chain team members? Well, yes, very much, and you and I have spoken about this. It would be great if we can include another language. Obviously, this is more challenging, but we want to be able to, through the network, find ways that we can reach out much more widely. So my hope is that over the next few weeks, we'll figure out a means to do that.
And maybe more generally about the languages, the working languages during this 1 year project. As you mentioned, George, we'll try to reach the most possible. So that we will use English, obviously, as the key language for all the drafts. But we'll also have part of the workshops and some publications in Spanish and in French.
Great. Now I'm seeing some other questions in the actual chat. You want to pick any of those up, Camille?
Yeah, I'm going to try to identify some of these ones. I just remember we received via email a previous question about the coordination challenge during this project, as there are many existing standards and initiatives in the sector. And one of the participants asked before the webinar how we would tackle this. Maybe you can answer this one, George?
Yeah, there's certainly a good point that was raised there. And so what we want to make sure we do is get a good cross-section of stakeholders participating on the technical advisory group, so that we can reach a number of different networks simultaneously. I think from my experience, work in this area of humanitarian logistics standards development has tended just to focus on aid organizations, principally international aid organizations. And a lot of that work was conducted by the individual aid organizations themselves. So while, when you're talking about procurement, there are many different commonalities between organizations, of course. It's simple things like the use of different acronyms and different ways of describing a process have been created this challenge and created this disconnect. And so that's why it's so critical that we provide the right approach. Sorry, typical when my dog starts barking, excuse me. But yeah, so coordination is key in my view, and therefore having the right consultation framework is critical to avoid some of the mistakes that were made previously.
Okay, I can see a question comment in the chat from Coralie No. She says that there are definitely a gap in common understanding policy guidelines. I trust you will be mapping the existing gaps in sphere, parcel, etc. Organization would definitely benefit from this and less of a struggle internally. So this is about how we'll use and build from existing standards like a sphere, parcel, existing policy and guidelines. George?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just I've lost my place there.
Okay.
So which question, can you just remind me which question were you referring to?
Yeah, sorry, this is in the chat. Corey Nor mentioned that there are definitely a gap in common understanding policy and guidelines. I trust you will be mapping the existing and gaps in sphere, parcel, and other standards.
Yes,
Would
yes.
benefit from this and less of a struggle?
Yes, I've got that. Yeah, I think I've sort of addressed some of that, because a couple of the key gaps I've already mentioned in terms of logistics and protection and cash transfers. We'll definitely map as far as is feasible to the core elements of the Sphere manual. And many of those obviously rely heavily on logistical and supply chain functions. When you're talking about delivering assistance, it's very much about logistics, certainly in terms of, you know, distributing shelter items, food, wash, etc. So there's a key need, and then some work I've also been involved with previously in starting that process. So we'll take that forward further as part of this project.
Okay, I think this answers also the last questions in the Q&A tool from Augustus Nelson. What are some of the existing standards? We mentioned the sphere, the parcel, and what specific standard this project hope to achieve? Thanks again, Axel, for your last comments. You really believe that the work continues when you want to reach the community through trainings, workshops, MOOCs, etc. I think we all think that this is really key to have something useful, a real useful tool. But we also have to recognize that this is a one-year project, so that's the end product of this one-year project will be the pilot version of the standards. And after this, we think we'll have the opportunity with other projects to test the standards at field level, and also to have these trainings, workshops, MOOCs, etc. George, maybe you want to answer the question about cash programming.
Yes, I think I touched on that just now. Do we have a plan to include cash program as cross-cutting issue and integrate it into logistics standards? Yes.
Okay.
Another question, is there online training on humanitarian logistics available now that you would recommend? Yeah, there are a number of online courses. I think the best one really that I can recommend is the Parcel Project. So if you go to parcelproject.org, you will find the links to that. And there's another useful comment here from Axel regarding age and disability standards, which ended after the launch of the pilot in 2015. And they struggled to make the standard known. Just by sending out the standard to the world is not enough. I understand that the project is just a year, but looking for funding for training would be great. Yeah, very much. Good advice there.
Okay.
And one issue just been raised, good point about carbon footprint and recycling. Yes, environmental, that's another gap actually that's reminded me. So environmentally sustainable supply chains and logistics activities is a key point. And in fact, one of the collaborators we're hoping to involve is the UN Environment Programme. And we're seeking advice on this also from the private sector that has quite a lot of experience in the area of how to reduce the carbon impact of humanitarian logistics activities and how to improve waste management, etc.
We'll also take advantage of another project we have within the Inspire framework contract with DG as an environmental expert is working on guidelines for ECO on this, and she'll be part of the expert group.
Great. Well, I hope that we have answered everybody's questions. If there are any others, please put them into the Q&A box. But otherwise, I think that's probably all from us now. Over to you, Camille.
Yes, let's see if we have, yes, one more from Will.
So Will says, just for comment, I'm actually looking into the ethical disposal of medication in Iraq and Kurdistan. Yes, so the ethical elements, ethical standards, I suppose, is certainly something that we need to consider.
Yeah.
And Fanny says, how do we keep in touch for next steps?
I think we have all your emails. We also asked before when you registered for the webinar whether you want to participate to this project. So we'll be in touch. We'll send next week the recording of the webinar and more information about the project. And we'll be in touch if you want and if you can dedicate some time to this project. We'll definitely be happy to have you on board. Thank you, Fanny. Well, I think this is it for today. I would like to thank you all for being part of this first webinar. This is just the beginning of the project. And as mentioned, we really want you to participate to this project. Thank you for all your comments, your feedbacks. George, you want to add something?
No, I just again reiterate, Camille, thanks for everyone to join the webinar today. We will be posting the recording on various sites so that it's accessible. We'll be promoting it through various channels, and we would very much encourage you to participate in future discussions that we organize, and would appreciate any feedback to today's session, as well as any future engagement on surveys that we might launch. But thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.